Martin, I'm really pleased to be speaking with you today. I found out about your book, The Revolt of the Public. I think I was trying to remember this morning when it first came across my radar, but I think it was in a newsletter by Bruce Melman, a consultant in DC. And once it immediately piqued my interest. I read the book. And then after I'd read it, I started noticing it all over the place. And there was a pattern in where I would spot the book. It was usually in references from many of the people I think are doing the best job of explaining the state of the world right now. And that I'll include onto you first. So that was why I really wanted to reach out and speak with you in person and get your take on the state of affairs today. But this is a rather eclectic podcast and an eclectic podcast audience. So some of the listeners may not be familiar with your book already. So I wondered if you could speak first a little bit about your background and how some of these ideas that went into the Revolt of the Public started to take shape.
Yeah, sure. Well, I had a long career with CIA. I always say I had the least sexy job in CIA. I didn't have, beautiful women hanging on me or played Baccarat in Monte Carlo or anything like that. I was an analyst of global media. It just so happened that I was an analyst of global media in CIA, which had an enormous reach into the world of open media, and probably the best bench of translators also in the world. At the moment when what I call the tsunami, the digital tsunami hit our institutions around the world. And I was not alone in noticing that as this tsunami smacked into various countries as they digitized at various rates, that there was increasing levels of social and political turbulence behind that, right? Now today that seems intuitive. Today, the idea that, okay, well, the internet hits and things go haywire. Well, that's of course. At the time we were saying, well, what's the connection? We really had no idea what the connection was, right? Why should a means of communication, where you can email your grandma or you can, at that time there was, the very early days of Amazon, get a book, on Amazon. Why should this make any difference other than, accelerate things that were already there? Communication means are already there over telephone. And it was a puzzle that was not particularly interesting to the powers that be at CIA, because it was the people who were interested, who were mobilizing into the internet at the time was mostly blogging. Were not institutional players. And what you find about when you work at an institution like CIA is that's all they care about. Even tiny little non-governmental actors that were not so tiny like ISIS, that's kind of like a little institution. These were just individuals. These were just people. So if all of a sudden, for example, we had Egypt, the Egyptian media. I don't know if you ever seen the movie Looking for Humor in the Arab World. The Egyptian media at the time that I was there, I don't speak Arabic, but I would read the translations. I mean, it was the most painfully humorless, boring, dry as dust stuff. The TV was, which is limited in time, was all Mubarak all the time. And let me tell you, he is not exciting to watch. So suddenly you get these bloggers, and they were blogging in English because at that time there was no software for Arabic for the script. And they were hilarious. I mean, you would just fall down laughing, and they were all anti. They were all the media. They had, of course, an official opposition, but everybody was totally respectful. These people were mocking to death the system. And you could see that there was something there, that a window into something new that nobody was paying attention to. And by the way, nobody did, including Hosni Mubarak, who got completely startled by the Arab Spring. So when I left the government, I tried to come up with an explanation for why is it that the system, this new information system has smacked into these countries, and suddenly things start to go haywire. And the research changed my thinking in some ways. I had thought, I thought basically it empowered ordinary people, the public, and I have a definition for that, against the people who run the institutions, who are called the elites. Definition for that too. Those two words can be used very loosely. I have a pretty tight definition for them. Um, but uh, the question was, would it change anything? Yeah, it gave voice to people who had no voice before. That was pretty clear. But would anything change because of that? And the big divide was the sadly misnamed Arab Spring, where this young man who worked for Google uh put out on Facebook a call for a protest on Tahrir Square in January of 2011. Um, and he said a million users saw the call. 100,000 said they would attend, and less than 3 weeks after that initial protest, Hosni Mubarak, he was like Pharaoh. Okay, he'd been there like 30 years. He was immovable. He was gone. Suddenly, he was gone. So now you have the case that, okay, these people who are all assembled on Facebook and other sites had also assembled in Tahrir Square and resulted in the overthrow of a long-term dictator. So that was the beginning of the moment, the revolt of the public, right? These are not people who are organized. They get into who the public is. They're not organized. They belong to many parties. While Ghanim, the young man that I was talking about, belonged to no party at all. But there were socialists there. There were the Muslim Brotherhood youth were there. The old people stayed away, but the youth showed up. There were just young people from religious backgrounds. If you had asked that crowd in Tahrir Square, and this gets to an issue in the revolt of the public, if you had asked them, okay, now you've won, what do you want next? They would start screaming. They were united and mobilized, and many of them gave their lives being against. They were against Mubarak, and they succeeded at that. But immediately after that, they dissipated because there was no single program that they were supporting. And so democracy vaguely was supposed to be what happened, but then the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections, and then they got overthrown by the military. And we're sort of where we were before any of this happened, but that was the original case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a fascinating case study, and you have so many in the book. This voice of the public concept that you elaborate upon in the book was one that struck me because of my career. Really, I don't think I shared this, but my day job is in crisis management for companies, nonprofits, universities, and the way you, yeah, and the way you described the attitude of elites upon hearing the voice of the amateur immediately resonated with me, because I work with so many boards and CEOs who seem like to be morally offended when they are confronted with a point of view, an opinion, a piece of information even that doesn't match the way they want to see the world. And it's that like personal offense that they seem to take at it that I always found so interesting. And I thought you captured that in the book beautifully on the sort of macro scale of the voice of the amateur versus the elites.
Well, I mean,
I've
a lot of it
wondered.
has to,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, all of it has to do with who the person is, right? It's if you are another elite, you will use the words that probably will not make you quite so angry, even if you disagree. There are ways of disagreeing, but it's the fact that you, Mr. Nobody, and here I am accredited with my PhDs that were sitting in my bureaucratic job in Washington somewhere, and you're questioning me, and why should I even care, right? And the interesting thing about those revolts is they went for about 10 years. Every time it happened, I would watch that, I would laugh. It was completely surprising to the governments involved. The ones in Spain, the ones in France with the yellow vests, the ones in Chile with the social explosion, all over the world. It was like, what the hell is going on? And after a while, they kind of figured it out. And now it's like, okay, we can't allow this to happen. They've gone from let's not pay attention to people too. Let's completely control the space, right? Let's control what can be said. This is hate speech. We're not allowing it. There are more people being put in prison in Britain today, about 12,000 things in name, than in China for online crimes, saying things that offended the elites, etc. So they've gone from
Yeah,
ignorance, repression.
yeah,
What's the
absolutely.
name
You
of it?
see it in right. You see it in Europe with the hate speech laws, and also in the U.S. and Europe both. I think in the explosion of the use of the terms misinformation and disinformation following 2020, which at one point meant something, but now I think too often just mean information that I don't like. And it's very, very much a top-down phenomenon. I think that the use of those two terms.
My
Um,
my, defi- my definition of disinformation is shut up, peasant.
yeah, yeah, it does feel that way. But I wonder, on a practical level, you and I are both in our in our work required to find the best information possible to understand certain situations. And increasingly, I find myself not going to elite legacy institutional sources of information. I'm going to some of the amateurs. And maybe they're very brilliant, talented amateurs, but they're amateurs nonetheless. In your book, you talk about the voice of authority drowning out the voice of the amateur in many cases, but I am wondering if at some point that will reverse and the voices of the amateur will just drown out the institutions because they're not relevant anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think the institutions are in total crisis mode. You have to go back and realize these are institutions that were set up in the 20th century where there was just a trickle of open information, and the fact that you had some to impart gave you authority. Just by the fact that you were a news person and you were standing in some conflict in Africa or whatever, and you were reporting on it, well, the rest of us had no ways of knowing. Every conflict in the world today, you're going to find thousands of people in that country who are talking about it online, right? So, I, you know, this is a profound and complicated subject that you could spend your entire life talking about it and not get at the bottom of it. But what is truth? I feel like the problem with the elite institutions and the elite information sources, and I have many friends and relatives who are very, very liberal, and I mean, New York Times or death. I mean, this is New York Times, and you look at things that happen and the gaps. Is mainly what uh, the old institutions have always done is set the agenda by what you choose and what you ignore, right? The gaps in you look at the non-mainstream stuff and what they're buzzing about, and there's silence on that. So the fact that these people over here who are not thinking like you are not even talking about the subjects that the New York Times is giving you makes you fairly ignorant about the world. You have no idea. And I mean, that's been because we all get exposed to the New York Times, whereas New York Times readers, elite following readers, don't get exposed to the other side. When you ask a, conservative, or you want to call it a member of the public, how did the liberals, the progressives think? They give you a fairly good description. When you ask the people who read the New York Times, the liberals and progressives, how do conservatives think? They have no clue. They just have no
Yeah.
clue. So it they are failing those information sources by default. Saying that, I would say the way you want to look at the world always, but particularly today, is as much 360 as you can. When you look at the New York Times, you get a point of view. That's an interesting point of view and an important one. I mean, when the New York Times backed off and said Joe Biden needs to stop running for president, I knew he was doomed. At that point, I said, you cannot run for president as a Democrat and not have the New York Times behind you. All right. So that's important. You need to know this.
Yeah.
It depends on the kind of information. You just have to understand. And the other side is the same, by the way. If you look at the New York Post, you're going to get a point of view. So you get as many points of view as you can. And this has always been the way with the human race. Only God gets to see truly objective truth from inside, right? The rest of us have a perspective, and the more perspectives you can get, probably the closer to reality that your analysis is going to be. So I would say that it's still very much worth reading the old institutional sources. It is definitely necessary to go beyond that so that you avoid those holes, those gaps that those sources now maintain. And you can get a sense of by perspective. If they all overlap and they all say this is a fact, then you know what probably did happen because everybody's agreeing. All the perspectives agree. If they disagree, then you have to kind of go to the ground and say, well, what are people there saying? So it's an interesting world when you're dealing in facts, as you and I are doing, I guess. It's an it's an interesting world um, when it comes to that. I think Barack Obama uh, goes around saying you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. But that's probably false and always has been. I mean, what is a fact? The fact is not some platonic thing that towers over us and compels us to accept it. It's something somebody has seen and reported on, right? And that person has a perspective. The old institutions had, and they've lost this a great deal, had this old, eye of God sort of style of writing that made you think that you were really just listening to just the facts, man. But there was a person there always, and the style was very, I think, deceptive. And nowadays they don't even bother with that much. So even our facts are disputable. Always have been, always have been. And if we have been made more skeptical and have been made maybe even a little bit cynical, we shouldn't be cynical and say it's all lies, but a little bit cynical, it's probably made us smarter.
Yeah, yeah. So we're focusing quite a bit here on media and cultural institutions. I also want to talk about governments. In the book, you address the narrative that democracies are slipping toward totalitarianism or authoritarianism, let's say. And you hear this from prominent voices like Tim Snyder and Heather Cox Richardson, and you say no, liberal democracies are slipping into paralysis. I wonder now, 10 plus years on from when you first, first wrote that sentence, I would assume, do you still think that the trend is toward paralysis, or is there a shift in some other direction?
Well, I always said, what you have is the digital dispensation, and now with AI on top of it, has is a powerful fragmentation effect. In other words, the 20th century mass world, mass media, we all saw the same things, mass consumption, we all bought the same stuff. Everything was done on a mass basis, has fractured. That's what the internet does. It creates, it probably, I don't know if you could ever prove this, or probably what it does, it revealed the world of opinions as it really always has been, except you need to manage it, and governments and institutions like corporations just put no, everybody really wants more or less the same thing, right? So a fracturing of government of our countries. I mean, there has been, if you look and you see, for the longest time, the the gravitational forces were all about everything was bigger, everything was more, that the EU kept adding people, the UN kept adding people, there were more people, dealing with uh um excuse me, with like tariff reductions, those rounds. And then it starts to go the opposite direction. The Soviet Union broke up, Yugoslavia broke up, the Sudan is breaking up. There's, Czechoslovakia broke up. There's the trend is in the other direction. I think within countries, societies are kind of breaking up a little bit. And so I would say my fear, if you were looking for that, the threat to democracy is way less from totalitarianism or authoritarianism, because all the pillars of authority are collapsing. So it's hard to be an authoritarian when you have no authority. But barbarism, sort of like what a Spanish philosopher called Ortega said is the vertical invasion of the barbarians, and they haven't come over the border. They're us. We have barbarized ourselves, and I don't. I'm an optimistic person. I don't think it's going to happen. But if you're looking for a threat, that's the one where we just break into war bands and start fighting each other, and um, it's just we winning and you losing, and there's no right and there's no wrong and there's no freedom. They just do it my way. So that's a possibility.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting nuance there. I think there are a lot of signs of that happening. Thinking though of what remains of sort of centralized government forces, you interestingly point out that the public, as you conceive it, more often opposes than proposes, and you were just talking about this in the context of the Arab Spring. Um, but I think you also wrote about Trump, at least when he first emerged as a political force, as more of a character of the border than the center, if I remember correctly. And in his first term, probably did govern somewhat like a person from the border. But the second term now has proven to be so starkly different from the first. There seems to be an ambition to exercise power effectively on a scale totally different from the first. So I wonder if you still really view Trump as a political figure, as a character of the border.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead. And what?
And if you see in the second term anything substantially different about the exercise of power and proposing as opposed to simply opposing.
Okay, so you have um a couple of things. Yes, the public is against. The public is very fractured, as I said. And if it were to propose something, they would start fighting, but they unite and mobilize by being anti, right? This has several ways it manifests itself. They can go out and have put 1 million people on the street, like happened in Chile and in many other places. The system just kind of collapses because the show of public opinion against is so powerful that people say something has to change. Or there are these populists. The populists are people who exploit that sense of of alienation from the system and say, I am your man. Okay, I am the guy who's going to change the system. That's a difficult trick to pull because if you've been elected president, yeah, I'm going to stick it to the man, but wait, you are the man, right? So it's a hard thing to do. I would reverse what you said, actually. I think Trump in his first term his rhetoric was absolutely wild, tends to be unchangeable. Um, but he was surrounded by these vanilla Republicans because he had no real following of his own. He was just kind of like this meteor that arose out of nowhere, right? Which is, by the way, what happens often in the revolt of the public situation. And he was surrounded by these vanilla Republicans, and it was a fairly vanilla Republican administration. This time, he had 4 years to build himself a real following amongst people who are experts in their fields and so forth. And I actually think he has come in, as you say, with a great deal of ambition about changing the system itself. All right. The whole point is the revolt is the system is not working. It's not democratic. Yes, we vote, but nothing changes. Yes, laws get passed, but nothing is done. Um, there's a gridlock sense and a further sense that this isn't necessarily incompetence, it's corruption. That's the way the elites want it. They don't want to change anything. They want to leave it. So we get these people who get elected on one party or the other, but it doesn't really matter. We need change. That's where the thinking stops among the public, right? Nobody has produced an ideology or a program that says this is the change we want. Well, so Trump is kind of trying to come up with one. I think it's an interesting one. It entails what is, I think, a necessary thing, whether he's doing it right or wrong. It's an open question, but which is a profound reconfiguration of the federal government. I think the major sticking point that leads to the revolt of the public is a sense that the public lives online at the speed of light. And government is this 20th century pyramid that doesn't even move, right? That's a big hierarchical, ponderous thing.
Mhm.
And there's absolutely no reason why in the 21st century, um, government shouldn't be flatter, faster, more interactive, as is the digital world. Um, some aspects of that, Trump, I think that the DOGE was, and when you see the corruption that, it's trillions of dollars go into our government, and half of it ends up in these, and anybody who lives in Washington knows this, right? Half of it ends up in just hands that are like this. It's just like, give me some, and I will do something, right? Tending to be friends of the people who write the checks. So as Thomas Jefferson always said, big government leads to big corruption. That's sort of what's happened. Um, he's trying to reshape the government. He is a bull in a china shop. He's not the guy who's going to give you, you know, laser eye surgery. He's going to, go at you with a butcher knife. So I'm not sure to the extent that what he's doing is going to satisfy the public. What you want is institutions that are aligned with our informational system and therefore with the public. That should preserve democracy. And we've had changes like that before. Whether what he's doing will get us there, I don't know. But he is, I think, yes, a representative of the vote of the public in office. As somebody like Javier Milei, who is, by the way, one of Trump's models, is doing the same thing in Argentina. This is reconfiguring the Argentine government. Which, believe me, that's a job.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you write about reconfiguring systems of government, you brought up the pyramid. Now, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
You speak about a need to sort of shorten, if not entirely demolish, the pyramid. You point out that human systems of organization have always been hierarchical to some degree, but the pyramid is simply too steep. I think it's certainly, Trump is reorganizing the federal government, but I'm not sure that I'm seeing any kind of shortening of the pyramid. And I think that's, partially borne out by the negative reactions to some of what the administration is doing. Um, do you see, I mean, am I missing something though? Do you see any evidence that the pyramid is shortening or may shorten after Trump leaves office and we have to deal with whatever's next?
No, I don't. I think whatever is going on is between Trump and his best buddies, and that's a very opaque group to me in many ways. I think he's doing some things that are correct. I mean, he's basically training. There are, for every activity in Washington, there are 8 organizations that are supposed to do it, and there's no reason for that. Okay, that's just money that's being spent because why not? I had a fellow worker at CAA that said, CAA is welfare for the middle class. There's like tens of groups within groups within groups looking at the same issues. So I think he's doing there's progress in getting rid of organizations that are zombies, that have been zombies for years. They're just staggering around. They are bodies without souls, and he's just putting them out of their misery. So there's some virtue in that. But no, and I'll say this, okay? When Musk was there, and I don't know where this stands right now, I thought there was a possibility that, and they were doing this, right? That if you put AI on the government, you suddenly, all that gigantic rabbit warren, termite hill, whatever you want to call it, gigantic tunnels that were totally invisible to the public and to the president too, by the way. I mean, these are things they were doing this so they could control them from the top. Suddenly became visible. You put the AI on all these agencies and suddenly know exactly what you're doing. And the president, if he spends, if he allocates $1 million to repair a bridge, can go through AI and see exactly what every dollar is being spent, whether they're actually doing it on the bridge, whether they're on time or not, who the company is that's doing it, etc. So you can suddenly make this gigantic opaque leviathan transparent, and all the people who are doing bad things are going to be caught doing the bad things. You can also, and this is the tricky part that has not been talked about or does, make that available to the public. In which case, without necessarily structurally changing the layers of government, you have, you have bridges the gap. Because now the public can look at AI and see, oh yeah, they can also see they're not spending the dollars on that bridge. And that's corruption, right? So they had that moment with Musk. I don't know whether they're still doing that or not. They have some
It
really
certainly seems
talented.
like not. Yeah, I mean that was an interesting moment where, as skeptical as I was of Musk getting anywhere near the White House, there, talk of making the government move at the speed of an app, and trying to make some of the expense and bureaucracy transparent so that you could remove it. That might have actually done some good, but it was pure chaos. Obviously it was just a bunch of 22-year-olds hopped up on Musk's cocktail of favorite drugs, and now all of the agencies have been rehiring back people they let go. And of course, there still is no government app. I can't pay my taxes or vote or do anything else on my phone. So I feel like none of those promises really borne out. But there were interesting ideas, and I do wonder if some of that could come back someday.
Yeah, it's only 22-year-olds, turning over. That's the revolt to the public you're talking about right there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure.
Just didn't do anything.
I agree with you. Yeah, I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure of that. I think. Well, let's wait and see. I
Yeah.
think there will be uh, uh, if there is no other effect. I'll say this one, which from my perspective is, especially having worked at CIA, which my entire tenure there was this completely apolitical organization, right? And the idea, you would have these directors of CIA that were powerful personality. You knew exactly what they thought about everything, right? And they were tightly connected to the presidents. But then you watch them retire, and they became these namby-pamby, very vanilla, because they didn't want anybody to think that that during their tenure, if they gave controversial political opinions, that during their tenure, the analysis of CIA had been somehow biased by the director's political opinions, and they were not. They might by tenure there. Whereas that has changed completely, or changed under Biden completely in a very terrible way. So I'll say this as a former bureaucrat: if what's gone on with DOGE, and it's still going on, by the way, and they still have some very brilliant people that I actually knew from before this last election, in that either in the administration or advising them from Silicon Valley. If the only effect is to terrify the bureaucracy, which had become totally anti-Trump and totally one-sided, into let's get back to neutral, because we don't know who's going to win next. It was a very stupid institutional move. It tells you our institutions are not brilliant, right? If it terrifies my old agency and government in general into thinking, let's not ever do that again, pretend that we're somehow fighting some righteous cause when half the country is voting for this one person, that might not be a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the bureaucracy certainly does seem to be terrorized, and I think there's a lot more to do. If there's actually an interest in, putting some of these lurking leviathans out of their misery, then I'd look to, the Department of Homeland Security first, and all of the half dozen agencies that are all focused on, defense and intelligence. I think we could really simplify and streamline that quite a bit. They haven't seen appetite for it yet, but it could happen. There are many more months in this term left to go.
Yeah.
I also wanted to shift from the federal level more to the local level, because obviously you have been quite skeptical of Zoran Mamdani in New York, but he also seems to be a man from the border. The similarities between Mamdani and Trump seem to multiply by the day. They both, I think, pay attention to non-institutional, centers of media and culture, and they're speaking directly to the people in a way that we haven't really seen before, even though Obama went on podcasts and things like that. I mean, Trump governs by tweet or by Truth Social post, and Mamdani is kind of going direct with his policies via Instagram, TikTok, whatever. So how do you think about those two characters and those similarities? And do you think there's anything substantially different in the way they're actually governing? Are those similarities just superficial, or does it run deeper?
They're totally superficial. And they're there. I mean, superficial doesn't mean they don't exist. They are, I think, character-wise or personalities. These are these two total experts. So they talk to each other on the telephone. You go like, I'd love to have that conversation. Who's silent long enough to hear the other guy? So I would say the difference is Trump really is a product of the revolt of the public. What is Trump's ideology? It's not the public. What is the ideology of the public? Who knows, right? It's against. What is Trump's ideology? Who knows, right? Depends on the day and the moment. Mamdani is a socialist, and he is a special kind of socialist. He is a socialist from, the wealthy side of New York City. So that he is kind of like what they used to call a limousine socialist, right? And that is an old-fashioned thing. Socialism, to me, has nothing to do with the role of the public. The personalities like AOC and Mamdani, but you see what's happened with her, and you see what will happen with him, I guarantee, is, they just get co-opted. They get co-opted into the establishment in a way that, for example, they tried to do with Trump in the first term, and successfully, I think, but couldn't manage in the second. So I feel like the difference is Trump is a change agent. Mamdani, I swear to God, I mean, it's hard for me to take him very seriously. He's the man who's done nothing his entire life. And not sure he even understands what being mayor of New York City entails. Already, his idea of he wants to kill all the gifted and talented schools and stuff like that, or the entrances into the special high schools for science and the arts and whatnot. Basically equalized down to the lowest possible level. I mean, New York City school system is one of the great schools, it's the biggest in the country, one of the great school systems in the universe. Count the number of Nobel laureates that came out of there, a bunch. And that's because it's based on excellence. And he wants to eliminate that because excellence is inequitable, right? You are a genius and I'm not. I guess I'm inferior in some way to you. That's not right. So let's just somehow or another, we're going to get rid of that. And, what happened with this idea of homelessness as being something that people actively choose as opposed to are just, out of dysfunction end up doing, and people dying because of the cold, with little red Mamdani blankets on their shoulders. I mean, I think, number one, has no clue what he's doing. I mean, Trump, whatever he was, he kind of figured before he was president. He had built towers. He had been a reality TV star. He kind of figured. Mamdani has come from nowhere, but he's got a very cut and dried program. I mean, when you listen to him talk and go read the website of the Democratic Socialists, I felt like I was back in the 19th century. I mean, it was like, okay, we've tried all this. Why do we have to do this again and again? So I feel like he is not necessarily in depth at a deeper level, a representative of the revolt of the public. People voted for him, I think, because the alternative was the old establishment. So in that regard, then the worst of the old establishment. So in that regard, he was lucky in his opponents, as Trump has been. And he has some surface, he wants to change things fundamentally, which is what the public says it wants. But he's got a program. He's got the program. And the second you say that in this fragmented world, I can guarantee you, lots of people are going to say, no, that's the wrong program. Once you stop being against, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
If your program is socialism at the 19th century level, it's, okay, let's just say it's OBE.
Yeah, I'll grant you that, the core ideology is definitely a product of the 19th and 20th centuries. I do wonder though, and maybe this is my primary interest in this. Like, I think you argue very convincingly that the public is not likely to produce um, lasting leadership because it constitutes chaos and disagreement and everything. And there's really not an ideology, but at some point we will need to move past the grinding of the tectonic plates here, and something else will have to emerge. Toward the end of your book, you talk about the possible emergence of a new class of elites, which would have to exist on a shorter pyramid, let's say, and be able to communicate, more directly with the public. And I wonder if Mamdani is maybe like, even I'll grant you that some of the ideas are old. I wonder if he is like a proto version of that potential new class of politician that can go direct, but that have to come with ideas because otherwise nothing gets done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that since I make no predictions because that's 100% sure way of being wrong, uh, I would say we have to wait. But if I were to speculate, which is always free and easy, um, I would say no. He is nothing like the future elites. He is like the past elites, 100% an antique, sort of time traveler from the 19th century had suddenly erupted on New York City at a moment where the New Yorkers just couldn't stand to vote for another member of the establishment, and he benefited from that. Um, I, I, I think the public. When you were talking about the elites, there is again my favorite Spanish philosopher Ortega Gasset. He says there is a relationship between elites and publics. In a sense, they choose each other, right? In the old days, the elites were the people we admired and emulated, wanted to emulate. So they would say, you have to be honest like George Washington, or you have to be industrious like Thomas Edison, and not give up. Um, Today, the elites just happen to be the people who are in charge and are the focus of like, absolute contempt by the public. At some point, we have to choose differently. And we choose every day by the movies we see, by not just the politicians and the money we give to political parties or campaigns, but the books we read, the programs we watch on television. Um, uh, there has to be a way in which we look to people who are trying to move into the 21st century away from this tectonic collision. How that has going to happen, how it's going to play out, I don't think anybody knows. Um, it could end very badly. It could end very badly for the just liberal democracy, but the economy, social stability, every number of things. I'm a long-term optimist, and I was born in Cuba, right? So I've seen disasters happen, and we're not anywhere near that. And I'm a historian. I've seen, previous moments when informational changes created terrible catastrophes, like 30 years more after the printing press. And we're not anywhere near that either. So, um, there's a almost Darwinian evolutionary process through which we will eventually select elites who understand the informational environment, both the digital and AI, know how to exploit it, know how to include the public in that equation, and we'll be back to just dealing with issues versus dealing with structures. Because right
Yeah.
now, and nobody talks about it, the structure is what matters. It's not the issues. You can talk whatever issue you mention. Okay, you'll divide 20 different ways. People start yelling and screaming until you fix the structure. That's gonna continue.
Yeah. Yeah.